There we go. So the speakers today is myself, Alexandra. I'm the UK Business Development Manager here at Slave Free Alliance. Shirley, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, yes, I'm one of the senior advisors relating to human rights in supply chains, and my background is one of working in supply chains. So hopefully that'll bring a useful contribution to our presentation and our discussions later today.
And Fran?
Fran Comerford-Cole, Director of Logistics for Cory. For those of you that don't know, Cory is one of the UK's leading resource management, recycling and energy recovery companies. We operate in London. We operate one of the largest energy from waste facilities on the banks of the River Thames, and we have a river-based infrastructure supporting and transporting London's waste on our fleet of barges and tugs and turning that waste into sustainable energy.
Thank you, Steve.
Hi everyone, so I'm Steve Lanigan. I'm Chief Executive of a company called ALS People. So we provide flexible labour solutions predominantly to the waste and recycling sector. And we're talking today about our experiences with Cory as part of the session.
Perfect, thank you. Slave Free Alliance introduction. So our mission is to help organisations of all sizes to manage the risk of modern slavery and labour exploitation within their operations and their supply chains. Slave Free Alliance is a social enterprise set up by Hope for Justice in April 2018. We are a multidisciplinary team, including former law enforcement, supply chain experts, trainers and investigators. So all this experience really shines through and really ties in well together. One of my favourite parts is that all the profits go towards global anti-slavery charity, Hope for Justice's work and programmes. Slave Free Alliance partner with businesses to help them understand and mitigate potential risks. So we really are here to assist and not assess businesses. So this should be seen as a partnership as we're all in this together in regards to preventing modern slavery. So we have operations in the UK, US, Australia and Norway, with the main headquarters being based in Manchester. Hope for Justice is based all around the world, as you can see. And Hope for Justice has a holistic programme to ending modern slavery. And as you can see here, Hope for Justice and Slave Free Alliance services all objectives by helping businesses to prevent modern slavery and to safely address it when this comes across, when everyone comes across incidences. Okay, so Slave Free Alliance, as mentioned before, is running this Lunch and Learn in conjunction with waste and recycling businesses, which are part of the Waste and Recycling Anti-Slavery Working Group. We are 18 members strong across the areas of the waste sector, and we aim to raise awareness of the issues and create solutions for mitigating the risks in the industry that the industry faces. So you may see us on social media under the hashtag Waste Sector Says Zero campaigns. So today's agenda, the introduction to modern slavery, will include definitions, key indicators, contextual factors. Then the case study from Cory and ALS People, including key pressures, pre-disclosure, disclosure, Slave Free Alliance support, post-disclosure, and key considerations. We'll then wrap up with a Q&A, but if you have any questions along the way, please drop them in the box and I can pick them up at the end, and then I'll run through any future sessions. Okay, so if you'd like to pass on to Shirley.
Thank you very much for that, Alexandra. Thanks for that great introduction. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, actually, how big is an issue is this in the UK? We hear a lot of talk about it, but is it really something that is going to affect me and my business, me and my work on a day-to-day basis? if we look at some of the statistics that have come through from the UK's own national referral mechanism, then they tell us quite a compelling story. And we seem to have a little bit of a delay on this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask to just hand the control back to Alexandra. And if you can just pop that onto the next bit, that's perfect. Thank you. So as you can see, the latest government figures, they actually show that about 12,000 people went into the government's national referral mechanism in that 12-month period. And that was actually quite a significant increase on the previous year. Prior to that, during the COVID period, the numbers had stagnated a little bit, but as people are actually moving more, what we're finding is that they're starting to increase again. It's really important to remember that these numbers only reflect people who are actually going into that national referral mechanism, and to reflect on the fact that actually large numbers of people don't do that. Another thing to think about is that while a lot of countries are represented again and again in those statistics from the government figures, very often we find that the same countries are continually featuring in the list of those who are most commonly reported. And it may actually be quite a surprise to a lot of people that actually the British nationality is actually now the most common. And part of the reason for this is down to the fact that we're getting more and more reports of things like county lines, which is a form of criminal exploitation where organised gangs actually groom and manipulate young people and children, very often into drug dealing, and quite likely that could be outside of their own town, outside of their own county. So just moving on from there and onto the next slide, when we're talking about modern slavery, we've just touched on one form, which is a more recent form, county lines. So just think about, well, what actually do we mean? And it does have that overarching title. It breaks down into several forms. Forced labour is perhaps in some ways the most obvious, and it's one that we do come across quite a lot. Perhaps less clear is what do we mean when we talk about bonded labour, and and what kind of debt are we talking about? And it can even include sort of family debt, something that a family feels that they've inherited. I've personally seen cases that have come from visa fees, recruitment fees. These can push people into a situation of debt that sometimes can take years to repay. And often when people are in that kind of situation, it can be further exacerbated when some businesses actually impose fines on their employees for what can be quite minor infringements, or even for infringements that people don't even know they've done because the rules are written in a language that they don't understand. Slavery and servitude. An example of that, you may recollect that Mo Salah recently told his own story of how he was brought as a child into the UK and was actually forced into domestic servitude. So that's something that, is very real. It's not something that, again, is something that's far away and doesn't happen to people here, because we know very much that it definitely happened to Mo Farah. And in terms of human trafficking, it's not necessarily just a case of somebody being trafficked from one country to another. That trafficking may be a case of somebody being moved from town to town, from street to street, or even in some cases, and certainly in the cases things like sexual exploitation, that can involve moving somebody from one hotel room to another. And of course, sexual exploitation is another form of modern slavery. But what we're doing today is very much focusing on those types that are perhaps more relevant to the kind of the industry that we work in, and that's often forced and debt bonded labour. So on the next slide, I want to think about what do some of the signs of modern slavery look like. And some of these, when you look at them on their own, they don't look particularly strong. Somebody looks like somebody's talking on their behalf. They're slow to come forward and somebody else always tells them what to do. Those signs of being controlled. People who've been made promises about a job, it's not a crime that somebody lives in relatively sparse living conditions, though some I've seen are absolutely, frankly, appalling. But each one of these on their own may not necessarily reach a level of criminality that crosses that threshold that will become a criminal instance of its own right. And I think it's important to ask ourselves that in your own business, how confident are you that your colleagues would know how to report concerns relating to any of these kind of indicators? Is your own whistleblowing policy actually clear enough that issues like these that on their own may not be criminal can actually be raised? I also just want to move on and think about, are there some things about life today that may actually affect our risk? So the first batch of these that we're going to show are the kind of things that workers are experiencing at the moment. We're all experiencing a huge increase in the cost of living. We're finding that housing costs, whether it's a mortgage rate or whether it's rent, are actually going through the roof. And that can create insecurity around housing. A lot of people are living in unsafe housing. They don't know whether they're actually going to lose the home because of, people being evicted because of rent arrears. We know that people are working on things like 0 hours contracts. They don't know when they're next doing a day's work, or they're on temporary work. They don't know how long it's going to last. So they've got an insecure income. And all of these things that create increased vulnerability, added to which, it all adds to mental health pressures. And that again is another vulnerability. And sadly, we're also hearing a lot of recent political language that actually seems to corroborate with abusers' threats that anybody who raises reports will actually be penalised and punished rather than be supported. So those are some of the pressures that the workers are feeling at the moment. But what about the businesses? So I want to look at the next batch of little things there that are things that our businesses are having to contend with. And some of these may be very, very familiar to some people on the call. You're also hit by those increasing costs. We know that fuel for transport, the costs of that are going up. We know that labour costs are going up. We know that businesses are struggling to get workers, and in some cases, they're being offered and resorting to people who are irregular workers. They've not necessarily got all the support and paperwork that they should have. We know that post-Brexit, there's a lot more complexity around things like visas and right to work. We know that, for example, people who are on the seasonal workers visa who were entitled to work in agriculture may well feel that actually, they don't want to go home after they finish that work because they've maybe formed relationships. They may overstay and look for work in different sectors. And another area is that, again, as a lot of people from European countries have returned home, and we're getting an influx of people from different countries, there are different visa requirements. We're also finding that we're getting more people coming from countries like Nepal, from Syria, from Eritrea, and we're finding that cases of modern slavery are being found amongst some of these nationalities. And criminality is also something to be very conscious of, that businesses need to be aware of. We often think about business practices and, doing our due diligence and things, but often business doesn't actually think that there's a criminal element out there that's also got an agenda, that's also got a business model. And there were over 9,600 recorded modern slavery crimes in 2021 to 22. And those figures were compiled by Justice and Care together with the Centre for Social Justice. And that came from July 2022 police data for recorded crime and outcome figures. And the last section on this slide I want to look at is also that businesses are finding there's an increased focus on ESG, on that environment, social and government, the human rights and environmental due diligence legislation that's coming through. They're getting more demands from their board and from their investors, and potentially more penalties that could apply. So there's a lot more pressure in terms of a business having to do that increased levels of vigilance in order to identify and assess potential risks and to train workers to spot signs and to be able to respond. So it's one thing entirely to talk about the theory of all these things, quite different to deal with an incident. So now I'm really pleased to hand over to Steve and Fran, who are going to share something of their own experience.
Thanks, Shirley. So hopefully I can take control and this works with the beauty of Zoom. But we're going to run through today our kind of case, but generally we're going to start with kind of key pressures affecting both of our sectors and how we can then kind of bring that into life. So January 2021, we uncovered a victim of modern slavery working as a temporary worker for ALS at Cory's facility in Wandsworth. And we're just going to break that down into key stages around the steps we took kind of prior to that disclosure from the victim, the actual disclosure itself, what we then did post that event and during quite a tumultuous couple of days to ultimately bring that person to a rescue, the support we received from Slave Free Alliance, and some of the key considerations that we took away from that, and hopefully we can share transparently today with yourselves. So from a recruitment perspective, primarily talking through the pressures that we will struggle with in the sector, and particularly with a focus on recycling. So Brexit, as Shirley touched upon, has had quite a significant impact on the availability of the workforce. So historically, recycling facilities would be heavily reliant on an Eastern European workforce. And almost prior to Brexit itself, at the point of the referendum and some of the press surrounding that, there was a perception of feeling unwelcome. There were significant currency fluctuations, the strength of the sterling versus the euro were quite tangible differences, and we saw a large volume of that workforce then either going back home or looking at countries like Germany for more sustainable employment. And clearly that has resulted in quite a large percentage of workers leaving the market. We've touched on kind of COVID-19, and I'm sure everyone's frustrated to hear that term again, but actually with a recruitment hat on, COVID-19 allowed legally the ability to remotely register candidates. So instead of us having to meet people face to face, recruitment agents were allowed to then talk to someone via Zoom, Teams, text message, WhatsApp. And that inevitably then opened up more of an opportunity for exploitation, for the potential for illegal workers joining the workforce, and to not be able to read the signs of things like body language, tone of voice, whether these people were potentially being oppressed by a third party. And the pandemic itself had a fundamental impact because there was more of a thing around social distancing. So some of the red flags that Shirley's touched on become less prevalent when generally people are not socialising, not in close contact. And we feel like that probably raised the risk of exploitation of the worker. Fulfilment generally, so I'm sure those in not just the recycling industry, but broader industries are seeing about the candidate shortage in the market. But recycling particularly is seen as a less attractive job. So we saw a lot of workers displaced through the pandemic that were then trying to find themselves into a new career. The jobs market was particularly uncertain, and the pressures on the recruitment agency now, certainly the last sort of 12, 18 months, to ensure the fulfillment levels needed within the recycling industry are pretty much unprecedented. But also for us as a recruitment provider, another challenge comes around kind of margin and generally things like cost of borrowing. So we pay the temporary workforce on a weekly basis and get paid by customers on anywhere up to 60-day payment terms. We've got to fund that payment to the worker through typically things like invoice discounting or cash flow, and things like the Bank of England base rates increasing have a natural erosion on margin, the level of overhead needed to provide fulfillment to, and that then makes us a higher risk to companies like yourselves where we're providing staff. That requires more diligence both from us, but also ultimately from our customers to ensure that for all of those factors and everything that Fran will mention, there isn't an enhanced risk of exploitation in the sector.
Thanks, Steve. So I think the issues that Steve has outlined in the recruitment market, and also the impacts that have been raised by Shirley, has certainly not been without impact for Cory or issue for Cory. Our business has been impacted by all of the pressures that Steve outlines, but specifically in the recycling industry and in our industry, the knock-on effect of having fewer staff to operate our recycling facility has impacted on the quality of our products, and it's reduced our throughput as well, all of which, as you can imagine, has had an impact on our performance against budget. It is, however, it's been really critical for us to work in partnership with ALS on these issues and to recognise the potential risks in relation to the exploitation of workers that all of these contributing pressures bring. And I think, as we've discussed, it's almost a perfect storm at the moment. And so we've really needed to look at the bigger picture. We've had a responsibility to do that, ensure that we find a balance between putting our agency provider under pressure to provide staff, but also with that risk that inevitably brings. And as such, we've had to work closely with ALS to find ways to retain staff that doesn't put them at risk of exploitation. I think a really good example is sign-on bonuses. You don't typically retain staff, and obviously if you are looking at labour exploitation, that's a really good route to take, unfortunately. So we've found different ways around this, and we've also needed to find in our industry different ways of working, so less reliance on labour while we have this shortage in the labour market. So looking at different ways of technically operating our material recycling facility. And we've needed to be, I guess, innovative to navigate these challenging times, and obviously ultimately to reduce the risk of modern slavery.
So I think we've talked about the kind of background and context that probably heightens the risk to all of our businesses of exploitation. But today we've been asked to talk to you about our incident in 2021. So to give some background to that, since 2019, ALS have provided what we refer to as a managed service, so a flexible labour provision to Cory's Wandsworth MRF. And we do that with a clear and cohesive sort of strategy towards protecting the well-being of the workforce, raising awareness at all levels in both organisations, including internal and external stakeholders, of the risks of modern slavery, the risks of exploitation, and generally kind of raising awareness about protecting the well-being of the colleagues. And ultimately, for doing that, we look to identify and protect both Cory, ALS, and ultimately the workforce against the risks of falling into enslavement in any form.
I think from Cory's perspective, as a company, obviously, we're continually assessing and addressing the risk of modern slavery. And we do pride ourselves on operating sort of with the highest standards of integrity, openness, accountability, and particularly in relation to sort of our relationship with our supply chain. As one of our largest suppliers, ALS, we have a contract with ALS, and it's been important right from the outset to have a set of clauses relating to modern slavery within our contracts that we both have obligations to fulfill. But equally a requirement for ALS to be a member of, in this instance, Slave Free Alliance, but it could have been another third party in relation to modern slavery. And what we also have is we have a very specific set of key performance indicators that form a schedule within the contract. And therefore ALS are being measured against these key performance indicators in relation to modern slavery weekly, monthly and quarterly. And Steve will talk a little bit more about this now.
So in terms of some of those checks that we do, but also kind of the broader strategy, so a key focus for us collectively is on training, engagement and communication. So ranging from posters in visible areas, communications on the back of toilets, because that could be the only place where a potential victim is left alone. Things like the ability to scan QR codes to look for additional training, one-to-one training sessions, e-learning, and a whole spectrum, right the way from the first engagement we have with a worker through to their induction, and then regularly throughout their assignment, so they can keep an eye out for their colleagues, but also they understand that things like living in a garage, not having access to funds are fundamental risks, and that isn't normal. We conduct proactive welfare interviews, so we have an independent account manager that will talk to the candidate, and we'll cover that off a little bit later. And also we conduct an annual gap analysis. So Slave Free Alliance come in and assess both Cory and ALS's policies, procedures, working practices, and try to look for whether there are risks to either of our business of vulnerability and assess that against industry best practice. And ultimately, it was one of those welfare interviews that helped us to recover a victim. So our welfare interviews are conducted one-to-one with a potential individual. They're typically done at random, but also potentially based on intelligence or insight. But those interviews, importantly, are done independent of the on-site team. So you'll have read from various cases where recruitment agencies are involved in potential exploitation. There's been well-publicised cases where it's actually the recruitment agent themselves that has gone bad, as the sort of good egg gone bad phrase would highlight, where they are potentially then brought into the gang, where they may have already been part of the gang and then infiltrated a recruitment agency. But things like Operation 4 for us, and based on the advice of Slave Free Alliance, highlighted why there was a need for independency of the initial recruiter and the existing team on site. That welfare interview covers off a whole spectrum of open questions, covering from where they live, their family circumstances, how much they get paid, whether they like the conditions, whether they've got access to funds, how they travel to work, to ultimately try and engage that individual beyond a very simple tick box exercise, but at the same time reading things like body language, whether they're being open and transparent, whether they're able to communicate freely, whether they can talk directly to us. And ultimately, during this incident, a number of red flags were disclosed. So we had a worker that had worked for ALS for 3 weeks, that was randomly selected from the workforce, and a one-to-one welfare interview was completed. That worker disclosed they were brought to the UK of their own free will. So they'd been in a drug dependency unit within Poland, had come out, and himself and 2 other colleagues had travelled to the UK in a Volkswagen Golf. Seemed perfectly amicable, no threats of violence or anything else. But when he arrived in the UK, he was living in a garage with 2 other males, and he had limited clarity around how much he was paid, how much he could access on a weekly basis, having free access to food. He disclosed that they would get 1 or 2 meals a day that would typically be from something like a soup barrel to allow them access to warm food. But also importantly, he disclosed that he was given a travel card on a daily basis and commuted to work with another colleague. But for us, the important bit, we had really robust policies and procedures. We documented kind of every scenario, but we did internal training and communication to really strip that back and simplify it. And the fundamental message for us was to tell our team if they had any doubt to shout, because actually for us, every disclosure will be different. But we wanted to demystify modern slavery, and that probably December 2020, a collective perception would be it can never happen to us. It's never going to be one of those things. We do all these things. We've got policies and procedures. We've safeguarded ourselves and our customer. But ultimately, we wanted our team to feel that they could raise concerns, that they would get the support they needed. And because of the complexity, we would then take ownership of that case at the director level to ensure that we safeguard the victim, we support our colleagues, but we also inform our customers of that.
So I guess I should start by saying that, as Steve's just outlined, we had all the policies and procedures in place, we had all the checks in place, but neither Cory nor ALS had any experience with identifying a potential victim of modern slavery, actually. And when these red flags were identified, we needed support. We needed support and guidance from a third-party specialist. And as ALS were members of Slave Free Alliance, we called on Slave Free Alliance to assist us in this instance. We're obviously now going to walk you through sort of our experience of the incident. So I'll just take you sort of through the steps. As outlined, one of Steve's 10 members flagged the issue, and in the spirit of our partnership, Steve called me immediately. At this stage, we didn't know whether any of the red flags would come to anything, but this was taken extremely seriously, and we started to put measures in place to safeguard this person in the first instance. I think it's fair to say that it could have been really easy for Cory to have shied away from this and let ALS deal with it as they were one of their employees. But as Steve sort of indicated already, the agency workers that work for Cory are very much considered to be part of our team. And it was crucial from our perspective at that time that we provided as much support as possible. One of the more difficult decisions right at the sort of outset that we needed to make was to send the potential victim home that first night. This decision was taken in consultation with Slave Free Alliance and obviously our two companies. And this was considered at the time to be one of the safest things to do to protect that person, and I guess not raise any alarm bells with the potential perpetrators. This was, I think, Steve will agree, one of the hardest things that we had to do over the coming week. And I think it's fair to say that Steve and I probably lost quite a lot of sleep that first night because we just didn't know whether that person would come back the next day. But that time gave us space, and it was critical that it gave us the space to be able to put safeguarding measures in place for the next day, to check through all of the CCTV, to look for alliances, to look for clues for any connections to this person, to check and to double check all of our data for any evidence that would help us deal with this situation. And I guess most importantly, ensure that we could protect as many people as possible, because at this stage we just didn't know whether this was an isolated incident or not.
So I think, as Fran's kind of alluded to, for us, we've been fairly open with, I can't go back for 1 second, sorry, that's fine. So looking at specialist support, so we've got someone who's identified clear red flags that is in a position of vulnerability, and we've had to make some really difficult decisions in partnership with ultimately people who deal with this type of scenario day in, day out. And for us, it was important to recognise that, because there was an entire evidence gathering phase, but also we needed support to conduct a specialist interview to obtain as much evidence as possible to both understand whether this individual was a victim of modern slavery, whether they were prepared to identify as a victim and ultimately to then be rescued, but also whether there could be other suspects on site, whether there could be other victims on site, and how best for us to support this scenario that for us was the first time we'd ever dealt with it. But sadly, we recognise that we will deal with future incidents. We want to learn from it, but also we want to ensure that as best as possible, we can safeguard the individual and support any potential prosecutions. So we engaged Slave Free Alliance at a very early stage, and they conducted a virtual interview because of COVID with our colleague present who had the initial disclosure, both acting as an interpreter, but also giving consistency to the victim, recognising their vulnerability at that moment in time. Between the three parties, we'd agreed a cover story, so that individual, for all intents and purposes, their colleagues, was seen as being taken ill and was being given first aid in a separate room while this interview was completed, to try not to raise any alarm or awareness amongst the workforce. They'd originally on registration disclosed a different address, but during the interview it then outlined that they were living in an address that actually two of the workers on site were sharing. So those workers, for us at the time, we didn't know they could be suspects, they could also be victims. And ultimately, we took a decision to protect for any further exploitation within the workforce, that those two would be removed from their assignment. And we would hand that information over to the police to allow them to both complete a search at the address We'll also talk to those individuals as to whether they were potentially involved in the exploitation or indeed they were victims of it. Now, sadly, neither of those two identified as being victims. And that is a real harrowing thing for us throughout this, of realizing the sad reality that some people would rather live in a garage in bunk beds with multiple other people than what they were dealing with in their homeland back in Poland for these individuals. But our victim who'd come forward and had disclosed then, ultimately we needed to ensure that they were placed into the national referral mechanism. And I think for us, this was another eye-opening area. So there were delays, both in terms of, I think the police's response initially left areas for improvement, but fundamentally, I think because Slave Free Alliance had rung them, not us, and had disclosed that they had also interviewed the victim, it was treated with more severity than initially it probably would have been, because we weren't as confident in how we should raise that to them. But ultimately that took then 7 days for this individual to be placed into the national referral mechanism. So we took the decision following the disclosure, and when the police had come and gone from site and interviewed the individual, but weren't able to place him into the NRM, that we would do so and ensure this individual was safeguarded whilst that delay was ongoing. So we took the decision to place the individual up in a hotel. We moved him best part of 30 miles away from Wandsworth to ensure that we gave him some degree of sanctuary whilst the rigmarole of placing him into the NRM was taking place almost behind the scenes. We were supported by the Hope for Justice advocacy team, where they spoke directly to the victim to engage with him about what the options were, how the NRM mechanism worked. And 7 days later, we put the individual up in a hotel. We paid for him to have food. We'd given him access to a new mobile phone to try and prevent the risk of re-exploitation. And ultimately then the success at the end of it was that he was placed into the NRM via the Salvation Army and given the opportunity for hopefully a better quality of life.
As Steve's outlined, it was a really tough week. I think it's fair to say it was really emotionally taxing. And I guess in a way we could have stopped ourselves there, patted ourselves on the back for a job well done, being able to identify and essentially recover a victim of modern slavery. And in a way to acknowledge that our procedures and practices that were in place had worked. But that didn't sit very comfortably with us, didn't sit comfortably with ALS or Cory, and we wanted to be able to learn from this. We wanted to be able to sort of seek to review what had happened and improve our practices if they could be, and see whether there was anything that we could have done differently. And as such, ALS, as members of Slave Free Alliance at the time, had an annual gap analysis, which was in a few weeks. So we specifically worked together to ensure that a review was done of all of the practices and procedures for Cory and for ALS, but equally that the incident and the way in which that was managed was thoroughly reviewed as well. And that work that was done identified some areas in which we could improve, but I think primarily it was really helpful from a Cory perspective in terms of our stakeholder management and from a sort of Cory perspective with our key client and obviously our investors as well. Oh, we've gone one too far.
Sorry.
I think just briefly, you can read the slide, but as we've both outlined, this incident was outside of our comfort zones, I think it's fair to say, and we definitely needed third-party assistance throughout this. As discussed, we received immediate and extremely welcome support from Slave Free Alliance in dealing with this critical incident. And I guess they've continued to provide support in the way of sort of reviewing our procedures, helping both of our organisations to continually improve in this space. And I think from Cory's perspective, again, assist with the stakeholder engagement piece for us, particularly around transparency, and I think that's something that we will talk more about. I should also add, from a communications perspective, we did also have the assistance of Hope for Justice as well, and they assisted us with how to communicate this incident in order that we could raise awareness and hopefully reduce the risk.
So I think for us, we wanted to then outline to this forum some of the kind of key considerations for us. So first one, and probably the most pressing one, and Fran sort of touched on the kind of sleepless night. The individuals working a shift from 6 till 2, and at 1 o'clock we do a welfare check. Really quickly thereafter, you've got to make decisions of, do you send them home? Is this person going to come back to work alive the following day? Could other people die if we make the wrong decisions? And it's rare, and hopefully sincerely rare for everyone, that you ever have to make decisions like that that are fundamentally going to have an impact on someone's ability to potentially live. But it's an incredibly fluid and dynamic situation. So I come back to the policies and procedures part. It's really difficult to cover off everything you read about modern slavery in a policy that is then tangible and useful to an individual. So we took a decision to make sure that that was done at a director level, that we engaged very quickly and very transparently with Cory. And throughout, our sole focus was on ensuring that we could protect this individual, we could give them sanctuary, and we could get them safe, which, whilst is a positive that we managed to do that, ultimately throughout the entire process, that is a harrowing thought to have in your mind, that we could make one wrong call collectively that could end up with someone dying at the end of it. And I think we're still trying to kind of come to terms with that. I've touched on the concerns around the delays placing ultimately a victim into the national referral mechanism. But for us, that kind of week post us putting them up in a hotel, we were on daily calls to make sure that he hadn't fallen back into the risk of exploitation. Our team were contacting him daily to make sure he had access to cash, that he knew what he was, that he knew what he could do, that we were going to get him safe. And trying to update someone who has limited familiarity with the UK, doesn't understand really what modern slavery was, didn't really see himself as a victim excessively at the start, didn't know where he was going to go next, didn't know where he was going to end up living, didn't really know who was going to help him. Trying to reassure him was particularly tough, and the delays getting people into the NRM, I think for all of us on this call and beyond, kind of supporting the advocacy efforts of not just Hope for Justice, but other modern slavery organisations, will hopefully improve that process. But I think the proactive approach for us ultimately helped us to identify someone early, helped to prevent a mass exploitation of workers, but also ensured that those steps we take are right, they're balanced, they're appropriate to the audience we're trying to address, and that work is actually engaged with what is modern slavery, could they potentially be a victim, and how can we then support them. And I think the kind of key takeaway that we've taken, not just from this incident, but there's a real red line that I think most businesses wouldn't cross, but looking at this internally as well is a key part. I'd rather have an awkward conversation with a customer that I can't give 100% fulfillment of labour at your mirth, than having a really awkward conversation of if I've done it through exploiting a workforce. So I think we're rather in partnering with companies like Cory, where there's a balanced and joined up approach to both support and fulfillment, providing the right work environment, providing the career progression and opportunities, but also supporting us with adjusting their processes and procedures, adjusting how they operate, and probably sacrificing profitability for the greater good of the workforce. And that for me is something that I've been grateful for throughout, but also is kind of a key takeaway of how we address that with customers in the recycling industry and beyond.
So Steve and I were asked to join a panel discussion last September at the Slave Free Alliance and Hope for Justice conference on transparency. I think one of the things that I was struck by was how all of the organisations on the panel had a lot of concern and debate internally, as we did at Cory, about reputational damage by going somewhat public regarding this event. In terms of that concern, we held a workshop with our investors and our board, and we worked through the pros and cons of doing so. I think it's fair to say that there was a lot of strong feelings on this, and after a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, we decided that the most responsible thing to do was to raise awareness and ultimately, hopefully, in the fullness of time, help to stop this horrific crime. The more that we talk about this openly and raise awareness, the more I think we have a chance of tackling this issue head on. Interestingly enough, one of the most asked questions at the conference was, what was the reaction to being transparent? And I'm pleased to say, and I think all of the panel members agreed at the time, was that we've had no adverse reaction whatsoever to being open and honest about this. On the topic of transparency, at Cory, we ran a training session in 2001 for all of our employees at Cory on modern slavery. At the time, we chose not to disclose the incident. And whilst the training was successful at raising awareness, I don't think it had the impact that the training session we've just run. So we've just rerun a training session for all of our staff this year, had, where we were able to discuss openly about this incident. By being able to discuss it openly, I think it's made the issue of labour exploitation real within our business. I mean, I think Steve alluded to before that, we probably were of the view that this simply wouldn't happen to us. But this has made it real and tangible. And I think that, as horrific as that is, we're confident that this means that our teams will be more inclined to look out for the signs at work, but equally outside of work too. And this can only be a positive outcome in terms of raising awareness on this horrific issue.
So, Alexandra, I think I've given control back to you, hopefully.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, Steve and Fran. So just to highlight the future sessions for Lunch and Learn programmes this year are below. We'll send a copy of this presentation out to everybody afterwards. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask now.
Hi, I've got a question. So if you had a red flag that came up in respect of, say, quite a few individuals with different surnames living at the same address, what would be the approach there of, without going in, like a bull in a china shop, what would the approach be to safeguard those people if they are victims of modern day slavery?
Is that aimed at one of us to answer, or you have
anyone who'd like to answer?
So kind of talking about it from our own business. So we employ something like 2,500 workers, but we will have a huge spectrum within that. So by way of example, we staff a warehouse facility right next door to universities. So we've got 16 people living in the same address because it's a student accommodation block of flats. Mm-hmm. But I think that ability to ask the questions in the right way, and I think there'll be red flags that just happen to be fine, that people might have different surnames, but they're married to each other, so they share the same bank account. There'll be a whole broad spectrum of things, but we look at it with kind of two hats on. One is going, let's use data to then look at where there are people we should target. So also I've talked about doing proactive checks. Some of those people will then, in our business, will naturally then get a welfare interview check. And I think the other bit we do is, it's beautiful nowadays. You go on Google Street View, you see the size of the address. You kind of go, 2-bedroom flat with 12 people living in it is probably a problem, but an 8-bedroom house with 6 people living in it is perfectly fine. And I think it's that intelligence gathering then with the individuals, because what we really struggle with is actually 3 people living in a garage. To me is pretty sickening, but those people didn't see themselves as being victims, and I can't make them want to address and come forward as being a victim. They're not being exploited if they're choosing to live in that way, even though I would argue they probably are being. And I think it's kind of that reasonable level of due diligence that you can do. we've tried our best to kind of say to people that coming forward and advocating as a victim isn't a bad thing, and raising awareness of that NRM process is probably what I would personally advocate of going, you know, there is a better life out there, and what you're experiencing isn't what's meant to be.
Yeah, thank you.
Any further questions? Okay, well, thank you so much to Steve and Fran, and thank you everybody for joining. If you have any questions, please drop us a question over. You can contact us via email. We'll put it into the presentation, so you've got our details there as well. But thank you everybody, and have a good day.